An archaeologist accidentally finds a tiny wooden house in the jungle. She decides to open the door, and in a second, her life changes. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching from. The air was heavy with humidity, so thick it seemed to press down upon every movement, every breath. For most people, the oppressive climate of the Amazon rainforest was an immediate barrier, an unyielding force of nature that demanded submission. For Ana Rivera, however, it was a call to persistence, a challenge she had accepted willingly. At 33 years of age, she had already carved out a reputation as a meticulous and daring archaeologist. Her specialty was not the grand monuments or vast cities of the ancient world, but the quieter, more fragile traces of cultures that history had nearly erased. She believed that in the silence of forgotten traditions lay some of the most profound truths about humanity. Her interest in South America had begun long before this expedition. As a student in Lima, she had been captivated by accounts of Andean civilizations, the vast stone cities of the Inca, and the intricate textiles that carried coded messages. Yet, while the Andes had long drawn explorers and scholars, the Amazon remained elusive, its secrets buried under layers of vegetation, its peoples misunderstood or misrepresented. Where others saw impenetrable jungle, Ana saw the possibility of voices long silenced by conquest, disease, and neglect. For years, she had prepared herself to face the physical hardships of the forest in exchange for even a glimpse into the mysteries it concealed. The current expedition had begun modestly, as most scientific endeavors did. Backed by a small grant and accompanied by a team of botanists, geographers, and local guides, Ana had set out with the official purpose of documenting plant species that might have ethnobotanical significance. Yet, beneath the stated goals was Ana's quiet determination to look for signs of cultural activity, however faint. A fragment of pottery, an unusual carving, a trace of ancient agriculture. Anything that might suggest that a sophisticated tradition had once thrived, where now only endless green prevailed. Their journey deeper into the rainforest began on the narrow, brown ribbon of a tributary that twisted through the undergrowth. They traveled in long wooden canoes, the guides steering with silent efficiency while the researchers clutched waterproof notebooks and cameras. The river carried with it the pungent smell of mud and decaying vegetation, and the canopy above created a dim, filtered light that seemed eternal. Ana often found herself looking at the surface of the water, wondering how many untold histories had sunk beneath its shifting currents. Once they reached a suitable landing site, the true work began. The equipment was heavy, and even the most basic tasks demanded energy. Humidity soaked their clothing within minutes, mosquitoes tormented them without mercy, and the air seemed alive with unseen movements. Yet, through all of this, Ana pressed forward, her eyes alert to any sign that the land before them bore the imprint of human presence. The botanists in the group were quick to point out new species of ferns and medicinal plants, but Ana was more interested in subtle disruptions in the ground, stones that looked shaped rather than natural, and patterns in the vegetation that hinted at ancient human intervention. It was on the third day of trekking that she noticed the first anomaly. While the group paused to rest, Ana wandered a short distance from the trail and found a stone partially covered in moss. Something about its surface struck her as unnatural. With careful hands, she brushed away the moss and discovered faint carvings, spirals that had long ago been softened by weather but still retained their deliberate geometry. She felt a thrill of recognition. This was not the random mark of erosion. Someone had been here before, someone who had left behind a message. She called over one of the guides, an older man with knowledge of local legends, but he only shook his head. He had never seen such designs in these parts. That night, as the group gathered around a small cooking fire, Anna recorded her discovery in her journal. The carvings were crude but unmistakably intentional. She speculated that they might be connected to ritual activity, perhaps a marker of territory or a symbolic representation of cycles in nature. Her colleagues listened politely, but seemed more concerned with cataloging the plants they had collected. Anna did not fault them. Each of them had come for their own reasons, and few shared her obsession with the cultural echoes hidden beneath the soil. Still, she could not shake the feeling that she had brushed against something larger, something waiting to be uncovered. The following days brought more signs. Fragments of pottery appeared where the earth had been disturbed by tree roots, their edges rough but unmistakably shaped by human hands. Charcoal traces lay buried beneath layers of soil, evidence of fires that had once burned in this seemingly untouched wilderness. Anna's excitement grew with each new find, though she was careful to temper her conclusions. She knew that archaeology demanded patience and caution, and that drawing bold conclusions too early was the mark of amateurs rather than scholars. Yet, deep inside, she felt her instincts whispering that she was on the verge of something significant. As they pushed deeper into the jungle, the physical challenges intensified. The rains came without warning, drenching the team and turning the soil into slippery clay. The canopy released cascades of water that seemed endless, and the trails disappeared under puddles and mud. Insects thrived in this moisture, and the constant buzzing became a relentless background noise. Nights were filled with the distant cries of unseen animals, reminding them that they were intruders in a realm ruled by nature. Through it all, Anna pressed forward with a mixture of discipline and wonder, recording every clue, every scrap of evidence. By the time a week had passed, her journal was thick with notes. She had sketched dozens of markings, listed the coordinates of potential sites, and carefully described each shard of pottery. Her colleagues, though weary, began to acknowledge that her work was uncovering something unusual. Even the guides, who had at first shown indifference, started to speak in hushed tones when they saw the stone carvings. There was a sense, subtle but unmistakable, that they were moving through a place that had once been inhabited by a people whose presence still lingered in the earth and wood. One evening, after a particularly grueling march, Anna sat alone near the edge of camp, staring out into the darkness beyond the firelight. The forest was alive with sounds, frogs, insects, the distant rustle of leaves, but she felt an almost sacred silence within herself. She thought about the cultures that had disappeared without record, swallowed by the jungle and forgotten by history. What if this expedition could bring one of them back into the world's awareness? What if the carvings and pottery were the first fragments of a larger mosaic? The thought both thrilled and unsettled her. The burden of discovery was heavy, for to uncover the past was to take on the responsibility of representing it faithfully. The next morning she rose before dawn, compelled by an energy she could not explain. While the others prepared for the day's work, she ventured a little way into the forest with her notebook and camera. The mist hung low over the ground, curling between the roots of towering trees. In the dim light, she thought she saw the faint outline of something unusual in the undergrowth, but when she approached, it was only a fallen log. Still, her pulse quickened. She felt that the forest was leading her somewhere, drawing her towards something that had been waiting for centuries to be seen again. The expedition had begun as a simple survey of plants, but for Anna, its purpose had already transformed. She was no longer just documenting flora. She was chasing shadows of a lost culture, guided by instinct, curiosity, and a deep respect for the people who had once walked these paths. She could not yet know the form her discoveries would take, but the first pieces were already falling into place. The carvings, the pottery, the traces of fire, all whispered of a larger story. And as she pressed deeper into the heart of the Amazon, Anna sensed that the forest had much more to reveal, if only she had the courage to keep searching. It was with this anticipation, heavy yet exhilarating, that she prepared herself for the days ahead. She did not know that within a short time she would stumble upon something unlike anything she had ever imagined. A discovery so small in scale and yet so profound in meaning that it would redefine her understanding of cultural memory. For now, though, she pressed forward, unaware that the jungle was about to open one of its most carefully guarded secrets. The following morning began with a stillness that felt unlike the restless rhythm of the previous days. The forest seemed quieter, as if holding its breath. Anna awoke before the others, her sleep fractured by dreams of spirals etched in stone and indistinct forms half buried beneath vines. She lay for a while, listening to the rainwater dripping from the canopy onto the taut fabric of her tent, a sound like distant footsteps. When she finally rose and stepped outside, the camp was blanketed by a fine mist. The humid air wrapped itself around her like a shroud, and the sight of the endless green stirred the same mixture of awe and determination she had carried with her since the expedition began. The group was slow to start that day, exhausted from days of marching through mud and heat. The botanists busied themselves with cataloging the previous day's samples, weighing leaves, pressing flowers, and making neat sketches in their waterproof field books. The guides, huddled near the small fire, spoke in low voices that Anna only half understood, their words occasionally punctuated by laughter or a wary glance into the trees. Anna, restless and unable to shake the sense that the forest was leading her towards something imminent, decided to explore a short distance from camp before the day's march resumed. She informed one of the assistants of her intentions, though she downplayed how far she might go. She needed space to think, to follow her instincts without the constraints of the group's slower pace. The path she chose was less a path than a barely perceptible gap in the vegetation, a corridor of shadow and tangled roots. The undergrowth tugged at her clothing, and every step seemed to unleash a new swarm of insects, yet she pressed forward with steady resolve. Her boots sank into the damp soil, and every so often she had to pause to disentangle her pack from vines that clung like living ropes. The deeper she moved, the dimmer the light became, filtered through thick leaves until the forest floor lay in a greenish gloom. She felt alone in a way that was both exhilarating and unnerving. The sounds of camp soon faded, replaced by the chatter of unseen monkeys and the occasional distant screech of a bird. It was after perhaps an hour of this solitary wandering that she noticed something unusual. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, a simple knot of roots or a fallen branch arranged in a curious way. But as she drew closer, she saw straight lines, angles too precise to be formed by chance. There, half hidden beneath ferns and the encroaching grasp of vines, stood a structure unlike anything she had expected to find. It was not tall, barely 3 feet in height, but unmistakably man-made. Anna froze, her breath catching. The object resembled a miniature house, complete with sloping roof and a narrow front face. The wood was darkened with age, its surface worn but intact despite the relentless damp of the jungle. She crouched, brushing away leaves to expose more of its detail. Her fingers traced grooves in the wood, and she realized with a sudden thrill that the entire surface was covered with carvings. Spirals, intersecting lines and stylized images of plants wound across the planks, their edges softened by time yet still clear enough to reveal deliberate craftsmanship. For a long moment, she simply knelt before the little house, her heart pounding. She had expected pottery fragments, perhaps crude tools or hearthstones, but nothing like this. The scale of it was baffling. Too small to serve as a dwelling, too carefully decorated to be dismissed as a child's toy, it occupied a place outside of ordinary categories. It radiated a sense of purpose, as though every line carved into its surface carried meaning she had not yet begun to grasp. Slowly, she circled the structure, mindful of her steps. The roof was fashioned from overlapping wooden slats, now softened and warped but still intact. The base sat firmly on the ground, though the forest had begun to claim it, roots pressing against its sides, moss creeping across its foundation. At the front was a tiny door no more than a hand's breadth tall. Its edges were smooth, and though she resisted the impulse to open it immediately, she could not help but feel the weight of anticipation pressing upon her. She took out her camera and began documenting the find. The light was poor under the canopy, but she captured every angle she could. She measured the height, the width, the orientation. She made sketches in her notebook, her hand trembling slightly from excitement. Each line of the carvings she copied as faithfully as possible, already planning to compare them later with the spirals she had found on the stone days before. As she worked, her thoughts raced. Could this be a shrine? A model of a larger building? An offering? She had read accounts of miniature structures used in ritual contexts in other parts of the world, replicas of temples in Mesoamerica, symbolic houses in Andean traditions. Could this be the Amazonian counterpart, a manifestation of beliefs that had otherwise left little trace in the historical record? When at last she allowed herself to return to the small door, she reached out with careful fingers. The wood was rough but solid, as if protected by some unseen resilience. She tugged lightly, testing, but the door did not budge. Perhaps it was swollen shut from centuries of moisture, or perhaps it had been sealed deliberately. She resisted forcing it open, reminding herself that the integrity of the object must be preserved. Instead, she crouched lower and peered into the narrow seam where the door met its frame. Darkness met her gaze, a void she could not penetrate. Her imagination filled it with possibilities, tiny offerings, sacred symbols, perhaps relics of daily life preserved in miniature form. The forest seemed to grow quieter around her, as if acknowledging the gravity of her find. Even the insects seemed to pause, their constant hum dimming into the background. She felt the weight of centuries pressing upon her, the presence of a people whose memory had survived in wood and carving when everything else had been devoured by the jungle. For the first time since the expedition began, she felt not only the thrill of discovery, but the burden of responsibility. This was no longer simply an academic pursuit. She had stumbled upon something sacred, something that demanded reverence as much as study. Reluctantly, Anna rose and stepped back. She marked the location carefully in her notes, using her compass and GPS to fix its position. The others needed to see this, though she feared they might not grasp its significance at first. To them, it might appear a curiosity, an anomaly, but she knew better. She knew that the little house was the first doorway into an entire chapter of history waiting to be written. As she retraced her steps toward camp, she glanced back once more. The house seemed almost to recede into the forest, its carvings merging with the play of shadow and leaf, as though it had never wanted to be found. Anna quickened her pace, eager to share her discovery, yet troubled by the thought that what she had seen might demand more of her than she was prepared to give. By the time she returned, the others were readying themselves to move. They looked at her with curiosity as she approached, her clothing damp with sweat and her eyes shining with the intensity of what she had witnessed. She said little at first, only that she had found something that warranted investigation. She would show them tomorrow, she explained, when there was time to reach it together. For now, she needed to organize her notes, to still her racing mind. That evening, as darkness fell and the fire crackled low, Anna sat apart from the group, her notebook open on her knees. She sketched the house again and again, tracing each spiral, each symbol until they seemed to blur into one another. She wondered how many more such structures might be hidden in the forest, what larger pattern they might form. She wondered why the door had been sealed, and whether opening it would reveal secrets or destroy them. She wondered, too, whether she had been meant to find it, guided not only by instinct but by some deeper connection between seeker and sought. Sleep came slowly to her that night, filled with visions of tiny houses scattered like sentinels across the jungle, each holding within its miniature walls a fragment of a vanished world. She did not yet know what awaited her, only that her path had irrevocably shifted. The carvings on stone and fragments of pottery had been whispers, but the little wooden house was a voice, speaking across centuries. Anna could not ignore it. She would return. She would uncover its meaning. And, in doing so, she would step into the unknown depths of a history long buried, a history that had chosen her, at last, to bring it into the light. The night after Anna had first encountered the small wooden structure was restless. Though exhaustion weighed heavily on her body, her mind refused to quiet itself. She lay in her hammock, listening to the cacophony of the rainforest, the shrill cries of nocturnal birds, the rasping chorus of frogs, the droning insistence of insects. But beneath all of that, she seemed to hear the silence of the little house, its sealed door waiting like a question. Each time she closed her eyes, she imagined the spirals carved into its walls, the way the wood seemed to pulse with age, as though it were breathing with the forest itself. She knew that she would return at first light, driven not merely by curiosity but by the profound sense that she had stumbled into a dialogue with the past. Dawn arrived in a veil of mist that rolled in from the river and curled through the trees. Anna rose quickly, almost before the camp had begun to stir, and went about preparing her gear with a focused energy. Her colleagues noticed her impatience, though they did not question her. Perhaps they had grown accustomed to her intensity, or perhaps they sensed that something beyond the ordinary had captured her attention. By the time the group was ready to move, she had already set out towards the place where she had found the house, guiding them with quiet urgency through the tangled vegetation. The trek was not long, though the jungle seemed intent on slowing their passage. Roots rose like serpents from the soil, vines tangled across their legs, and the air grew so thick with moisture that every breath felt like a burden. At last, though, the form of the little house emerged from the undergrowth, just as Anna had left it. For a moment, no one spoke. The guides exchanged glances, their expressions uncertain. The botanist bent down to examine the carvings, clearly impressed but unsure of their significance. Anna remained silent, allowing them to absorb what they were seeing. She wanted the structure to speak for itself before she gave voice to her own interpretations. After the initial silence, questions came quickly. What was it? How old could it be? Why had it been built so small? Anna did not answer immediately. Instead, she crouched again before the tiny door, her hand steady now, despite the anticipation building inside her. She explained to the group what she had observed the day before: the carvings, the craftsmanship, the unusual scale. She pointed out that while miniature structures existed in other ancient cultures, their appearance in the Amazon had never been documented in such tangible form. The others listened with a mixture of interest and skepticism. They were scientists, after all, and science demanded proof, not wonder. With their cautious approval, Anna prepared to investigate the interior. She had brought a set of delicate tools meant for excavating fragile objects. Carefully, she pressed at the edge of the door, prying ever so slightly, mindful of the wood's fragility. To her surprise, it yielded more easily than expected, the swollen fibers of the frame releasing with a soft groan. Slowly, the door creaked open, revealing the darkness within. The group leaned closer, their breath held, as Anna lifted her flashlight and shone it into the interior. What lay inside was not what she had feared, nor exactly what she had hoped, but it was extraordinary nonetheless. The chamber, though small, was carefully arranged. At its center sat a clay vessel, no larger than her palm, its surface decorated with patterns echoing the spirals carved into the walls. Around it lay a scattering of seeds, dry but preserved, their shapes unfamiliar. Small figurines carved from wood and bone rested against the walls, tiny representations of human figures, animals, and plants. Each object seemed positioned deliberately, as though to convey a message. Anna felt her chest tighten as she took in the sight. It was a miniature world, a symbolic space echoing the larger one outside. The little house was not empty, but alive with meaning, a repository of knowledge condensed into a form both intimate and sacred. She glanced at the guides, who stood back now, their faces solemn. One of them muttered something under his breath, a word Anna did not recognize but whose tone carried reverence. The botanists bent closer to the seeds, their curiosity piqued. Anna, however, was captivated less by the physical objects than by the intent behind them. These were not mere curiosities. They were artifacts of belief, fragments of a worldview that had endured despite centuries of silence. She carefully began to document the contents, sketching each item and photographing them from multiple angles. The vessel she described in detail, noting the precision of its decoration. The seeds she collected into a sterile container, intending to later analyze their species. The figurines she left untouched, sensing that their arrangement was as important as their form. As she worked, her thoughts raced. Could this have been a symbolic burial, a shrine dedicated to ancestors, or perhaps a kind of time capsule designed to preserve agricultural knowledge through ritual form? The more she examined, the stronger her conviction grew that the house was part of a larger tradition. She began to search the surrounding area, brushing aside leaves and probing the ground with her trowel. Within minutes, she found traces of another structure, collapsed, its wood rotted beyond recognition, but still bearing the outline of a foundation. A third soon followed, smaller but similar in design. It was clear now that the house she had found was not unique, but part of a wider system. Returning to the first structure, Anna sat back on her heels and let the realization wash over her. The Amazon had been described by outsiders as a wilderness untouched by civilization, a place where cultures lived and vanished without leaving lasting monuments. Yet here, in the form of these miniature houses, was evidence of a sophisticated symbolic practice. These people had chosen to leave their mark not in towering temples or massive cities, but in small, precise vessels of memory. The humility of their scale did not diminish their significance. If anything, it magnified it, for it suggested a culture that valued subtlety, continuity, and the preservation of life through seeds and symbols rather than conquest and stone. The weight of the discovery pressed upon her as she closed the tiny door once more. She felt both exhilarated and humbled. In that moment, she understood that the challenge ahead would not merely be to interpret these objects, but to do so with the respect they deserved. Every detail mattered. The placement of the seeds, the orientation of the carvings, the choice of animals and plants depicted. They were fragments of a language long silenced, and it was her task to listen carefully, to reconstruct meaning without imposing her own assumptions. As the day waned and shadows stretched across the forest floor, the group prepared to return to camp. Anna lingered, reluctant to leave the little house behind. She placed her hand gently on its roof, feeling the rough grain of the wood beneath her palm. For an instant she imagined the hands that had built it, carving patiently, arranging offerings with care. They had done so not for recognition or glory, but for continuity, for memory. In discovering their work, Anna felt as though she had been entrusted with a responsibility greater than herself. Back at camp that evening, she recorded her findings with meticulous detail, filling page after page of her journal. She wrote not only about the physical evidence, but about the impressions it left upon her, the sense of intentionality, the echoes of ritual. Her colleagues listened, some intrigued, others skeptical. Yet none could deny the uniqueness of the discovery. They, too, had felt something in the presence of the little house, though perhaps they lacked the words to describe it. That night, as Anna lay once more in her hammock, she realized that her journey had shifted irrevocably. What had begun as a botanical survey was now an archaeological odyssey, a pursuit that reached beyond science into the realm of meaning. She thought of the seeds, the figurines, the vessel, and the spirals that bound them all together. She thought of the larger pattern waiting to be uncovered, hidden in the forest beyond. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, her dreams were filled not with fragments, but with possibilities. Entire landscapes of miniature houses scattered like stars, each carrying within it a piece of a vanished world. And as dawn approached, Anna knew with certainty that the mystery had only deepened. The little house was not an isolated artifact. It was an opening, a threshold. Beyond it lay a hidden complex, a web of meaning that would demand every ounce of her skill, her patience, and her respect to unravel. She was no longer simply an observer. She was now a participant in the dialogue between past and present, and the forest had chosen her to listen. Morning returned with a brilliance that seemed almost mocking in its beauty, shafts of sunlight piercing through the canopy and painting the wet leaves with streaks of gold. The forest was alive with sound, birds calling from unseen perches, monkeys crashing through distant branches, insects droning in an endless symphony. Yet, to Anna, the liveliness of the jungle only heightened the sense of urgency that gripped her. The discovery of the little house, with its vessel, seeds, and figurines, had transformed her understanding of this expedition. It was no longer about small fragments or hints of human presence. It was about piecing together the structure of a tradition that had been deliberately planted into the landscape, and she was determined to follow its threads. After breakfast, she gathered the group together and spoke with a conviction that surprised even herself. She explained that the first house could not stand alone. There had to be more, a network or pattern concealed beneath the foliage. If they were to understand its meaning, they needed to expand their search beyond the immediate clearing. The others exchanged uncertain looks, some hesitant, others intrigued, but the discovery had left them unable to dismiss her claims. Even the guides, though wary, agreed to help, their silence carrying the weight of something they perhaps felt but could not articulate. Anna led them back to the site, her notes and sketches in hand. She retraced every step she had taken, this time moving outward in widening circles from the first structure. The air grew heavier as the sun rose, each movement through the vegetation releasing the thick, damp heat trapped beneath the canopy. Sweat soaked their clothing, and mosquitoes buzzed incessantly at their ears. Yet Anna hardly noticed. Her eyes scanned the ground with the precision of someone searching for a lost language written in the earth. It was not long before the first sign appeared. Half buried under a mat of roots lay a cluster of stones, their edges aligned too neatly to be natural. With careful hands, Anna pulled away vines and cleared soil until the outline of a small platform emerged, its shape square, its corners deliberate. Excitement surged through her chest as she called the others over. They crouched beside her, watching as she brushed the surface with slow, reverent strokes. Though eroded, the stones still bore the faint incisions of human hands. Another house had once stood here, its wooden frame long since rotted away, but its foundation stubbornly clung to the earth. The revelation electrified the group. Energy spread through them, replacing the weariness of the heat. They began to search with renewed vigor, probing the undergrowth, following the subtle dips and rises of the terrain. Soon, a second foundation was found, this one accompanied by a scatter of wooden fragments so decomposed they crumbled at the touch. And then a third, partially intact, with remnants of carvings on wood so fragile it seemed to dissolve beneath the lightest breath. Each new discovery deepened the certainty that the first house was not an anomaly, but a surviving example of a larger system. Anna moved through the clearing with a growing sense of awe. The pattern was beginning to reveal itself. The houses were arranged in a loose arc, oriented in similar directions, their foundations aligned with a precision that suggested intention rather than chance. Between them ran shallow depressions in the soil, channels that seemed to form pathways or perhaps waterways. Kneeling to examine one, Anna noticed the way the earth had been shaped, as though once used to divert the flow of rain. The guides murmured among themselves, pointing out that such channels would have prevented flooding, protecting whatever was stored within the structures. As she pieced these fragments together, Anna felt the image sharpening in her mind. A complex, carefully constructed, not for habitation but for ritual or preservation. Each little house had served a role within it, perhaps as a guardian of seeds, a keeper of tools, or a symbolic shelter for ancestors. Together they formed a mosaic of memory, a village not for the living, but for knowledge itself. She imagined a people gathering here, their ceremonies unfolding among the tiny doors, each act an offering to continuity. She spent hours moving between the sites, sketching their positions, mapping their orientations, and recording every detail. Her colleagues joined her, measuring distances, collecting soil samples, and photographing each trace. What began as cautious curiosity evolved into collective focus. Even the botanists, whose main task had been to classify plant specimens, began to see how the seeds within the houses might be connected to cultivation practices, the preservation of agriculture as sacred knowledge. The discovery began to unite them all in purpose. By late afternoon, the clearing had transformed in their eyes. No longer a random patch of jungle, it was a living archive. The forest had done its best to reclaim it, wrapping roots around foundations, scattering leaves over carvings, dripping water into every crevice. But beneath that disguise lay order, structure, and intention. Anna felt as though the trees themselves had been guardians, shielding the complex until someone with the patience to listen arrived. Exhaustion eventually pulled them back toward camp, but Anna lingered until the last possible moment. She crouched once more before the first house, its carvings glowing faintly in the waning light. She touched the roof lightly, her mind buzzing with questions. Who had built these houses? How long ago had the ceremonies ceased? What did each symbol, each seed, each figurine mean within the greater pattern? She had answers only in fragments, but the questions themselves filled her with exhilaration. For the first time, she felt she was standing not at the edge of discovery, but within its heart. That evening, around the fire, the group spoke with a new energy. They speculated about the purpose of the complex, debated its age, and marveled at its preservation. Anna listened, recording their thoughts alongside her own. She felt a profound sense of responsibility settling upon her. This was not a discovery to be rushed or sensationalized. It demanded care, patience, and reverence. It was not just about science. It was about honoring the memory of those who had left these traces, ensuring their voices were not misrepresented or drowned out by the noise of modern interpretation. As the fire crackled low and the forest hummed with nocturnal life, Anna withdrew into her tent and opened her journal. She wrote until her hand cramped, her words spilling onto the page in dense lines of observation, speculation, and wonder. She recorded every measurement, every orientation, every impression of meaning. Yet, beneath the meticulous notes ran a current of emotion she could not suppress, the feeling that she had entered into a covenant with the past. She had been shown a glimpse of something precious, and it was now her duty to guard and reveal it with dignity. Sleep claimed her only in the deepest hours of the night, and her dreams were vivid. She saw the clearing not as it was now, but as it might have been centuries ago, filled with people who moved quietly among the little houses, carrying vessels of seeds, placing offerings of carved figures, speaking words she could not understand but felt in her bones. The houses glowed with firelight, their carvings alive with motion, and at the center of it all she stood as both intruder and witness, chosen not by design but by the persistence that had carried her into their forgotten world. When she woke at dawn, her chest was tight with the echo of those dreams. The hidden complex was no longer hidden. It had chosen to reveal itself, and she knew she could not turn away. The path ahead would demand everything of her scholarship, her patience, her respect, but she was ready. The forest had opened its doors, and she had stepped inside. The days that followed became an unbroken rhythm of discovery, exhaustion, and reflection. Anna no longer felt like a visitor trudging through an unwelcoming jungle. She felt as if she had been invited into a dialogue that spanned centuries, each day peeling back another layer of silence. The clearing, with its hidden foundations, its fragile remains of wooden structures, and its surviving little house, had transformed from a patch of wilderness into a living archive. Yet, even as she mapped its outlines and recorded its measurements, she understood that the true heart of the discovery lay not in its physicality, but in the language inscribed upon it. The symbols carved into wood, etched into vessels, and embedded within the arrangement of seeds and figurines. To understand them was to understand the culture that had created them. Anna spent long hours crouched beside the first house, her notebook open, her pencil moving across the page with obsessive precision. She copied each spiral, each geometric form, each tiny carved figure until the lines swam before her eyes. By day's end, her hands ached, but she persisted, convinced that the carvings contained patterns that could be deciphered. Some of the designs were familiar. She had encountered similar motifs in colonial-era chronicles where Spanish friars had described the strange drawings of Amazonian peoples, dismissing them as primitive or superstitious. Yet Anna knew better. These were not idle decorations. They were systems of meaning, symbolic codices that encoded knowledge in forms subtle enough to withstand time, yet powerful enough to transmit across generations. Her nights were consumed with study. By the dim light of a lantern, she spread her notes across the floor of her tent, arranging sketches side by side, comparing curves and angles, searching for repetitions. She recalled passages from 16th century manuscripts she had studied during her training, descriptions of signs that represented celestial cycles, of patterns in weaving that mirrored the movement of the stars, of agricultural calendars encoded in song and dance. What if the spirals carved into the house's walls were not merely decorative, but representations of cycles? Planting and harvest, life and death, rain and drought. The thought made her shiver, not from fear, but from exhilaration. One evening, as she sat over her sketches, one of the botanists entered the tent carrying the small container of seeds collected from inside the house. He had examined them carefully and now reported his findings. Several were varieties of maize, though unusually small, perhaps adapted to the wet soil of the rainforest. Others were beans, recognizable though of a strain he had never seen catalogued. A few were entirely unfamiliar, their shapes unlike any modern species. To Anna, the implications were staggering. The seeds were not random offerings but deliberate selections, a curated library of cultivation. Combined with the carvings, they suggested that the houses had served as both symbolic shrines and practical repositories, preserving the memory of agriculture itself. The figurines, too, demanded interpretation. Carved from wood and bone, they depicted not only humans but animals and plants. One showed a woman bent over with a bundle of stalks, another a jaguar poised as though guarding. Others portrayed birds, fish, and crops, with an attention to detail that belied their size. Anna wondered if they represented stories or myths, a miniature pantheon that tied together the cycles of nature with the rhythms of human life. She began to suspect that each house was a chapter in a narrative, a fragment of a larger text whose pages had been scattered across the clearing. The guides, though reluctant to speak at first, gradually offered whispers of knowledge passed down through their families. One elder man told Anna in halting Spanish that his grandfather had spoken of the houses of memory, though he admitted he had never believed such places truly existed. According to the story, the ancestors built them to teach without words, to preserve the teachings of plants and seasons so that even if voices were lost, the knowledge would endure. Anna listened intently, her heart pounding. The tale matched perfectly with her emergent interpretation, reinforcing the idea that these were not tombs or mere curiosities, but instruments of cultural transmission. She returned to the carvings with renewed intensity. The spirals, she realized, often began with a small seed-like dot at the center, expanding outward in widening circles. Could they represent growth, germination, the unfolding of life from a single kernel? Other carvings showed intersecting lines that reminded her of rivers, branching and converging. Perhaps they were maps of water systems, guidance for irrigation or seasonal floods. Still, others resembled the phases of the moon, crescents and circles repeating in ordered succession. Together, they suggested a worldview that wove together astronomy, agriculture, and spirituality into one coherent system. The more she studied, the more Anna felt herself entering into communion with the minds that had created these symbols. She could almost feel their presence beside her, patient and watchful, guiding her hand as she traced their spirals. She knew she could never fully capture their meaning. No outsider could, but she could at least begin to translate their intentions into words that modern scholarship might understand. She imagined presenting her findings one day, not as a claim of mastery, but as a testimony to voices long denied. Her colleagues began to see the significance as well. The botanists grew increasingly excited about the prospect of testing the seeds to see if viable strains might still be coaxed into growth. The geographer noted the alignment of the houses, speculating about celestial orientations, their placement perhaps tied to solstices or equinoxes. Each discipline added a layer to the interpretation, and Anna, though protective of her own insights, welcomed their contributions. It was becoming clear that the discovery was too vast for one perspective alone. Yet, with each breakthrough came a sense of solemnity. Anna felt the weight of responsibility pressing on her shoulders. To reveal this knowledge was to bring it into a world that might exploit rather than honor it. The thought troubled her deeply. She had read too many accounts of sacred sites desecrated in the name of science, too many stories of artifacts removed from their context and displayed behind glass, stripped of the meaning that had once animated them. She swore silently that she would not allow that fate for the little houses. If they were to be studied, it would be with reverence, their story told not as relics, but as living voices of a culture that had entrusted her with its memory. One night, as the fire dwindled to embers and the forest sang its nocturnal chorus, Anna sat apart from the others, staring at the sketches spread across her lap. The carvings no longer looked like random marks. They pulsed with meaning, each line a thread in a tapestry that bound together earth, sky, water, and life. She closed her eyes and imagined the people who had carved them, hands steady with purpose, eyes fixed not on the present moment but on generations yet to come. She imagined them placing the seeds with care, positioning the figurines as guardians, closing the tiny door as a promise to the future. And she realized with a swell of emotion that she was not simply deciphering symbols. She was listening to a conversation across centuries, one that had waited patiently for someone willing to hear. By the end of that week, her notes had grown into a sprawling compendium of sketches, hypotheses, and reflections. The little house that had once seemed an isolated curiosity was now the key to a vast archive, a culture's attempt to encode its essence into forms small enough to survive the vastness of time. Anna felt both humbled and empowered. She was no longer merely cataloging, she was translating memory into understanding. And though the task was immense, she knew she was ready. For the forest had revealed its language, and she had begun to learn how to read. The days bled together, each one marked by the same routine of meticulous observation, laborious excavation, and endless note-taking. Yet, for Anna, there was no monotony in the work. Every symbol she copied, every seed she documented, every crumbling foundation she traced into her maps deepened her sense of connection to the unknown people who had once built this hidden complex. The clearing was no longer just a site of curiosity. It was a message across centuries, one that she now felt duty-bound to safeguard. But with the exhilaration of discovery came a mounting weight, a burden that pressed against her mind even as she pressed forward with her research. It began with the seeds. At first, they had seemed like artifacts, dry relics carefully preserved as offerings or symbols of renewal. Yet, as her colleagues studied them more closely, the truth became clear. Many were viable, their cores intact, their potential for life undiminished by centuries underground. The botanists whispered excitedly about the possibility of cultivating them, of reviving ancient strains of maize and beans, of rediscovering plants lost to modern agriculture. To them, it was a scientific opportunity, a chance to bring back what history had erased. But to Anna, it was something else entirely. These seeds were not mere genetic material. They were a sacred inheritance, a legacy entrusted to the tiny wooden houses as a promise to future generations. To plant them recklessly would be to betray that trust. She found herself torn between the rigor of scholarship and the reverence demanded by the site. Each evening, after hours spent measuring, recording, and documenting, she would sit by the fire with her journal open, staring at the pages filled with her own handwriting. Her notes were precise, clinical, the kind expected of a researcher, but beneath them she scribbled fragments of thought, half-poetic lines that betrayed her deeper turmoil. We are not the owners of this knowledge. We are only its witnesses. To expose it is to risk destroying it. To hide it is to risk forgetting it once more. Her colleagues noticed her distraction. One of the botanists pressed her to allow samples of the seeds to be sent to a laboratory as soon as they returned, arguing that time was of the essence. A geographer speculated aloud about publishing a preliminary report, his excitement betraying the hunger for recognition that all scholars secretly carried. Even the guides, who had at first been hesitant, began to ask what would become of the houses, whether outsiders would soon swarm the forest to unearth more of them. Each question added to the pressure building inside Anna. She wanted to protect the site, to shield it from exploitation, but she knew that discovery could not remain hidden forever. One evening, after the day's work had ended and the campfire crackled low, Anna walked alone back to the clearing. The moon was nearly full, its silver light slipping through breaks in the canopy and spilling across the ground. The little house seemed to glow faintly in that light, its carvings alive with shadow and shine. She crouched before it, pressing her hand lightly to the roof. The wood was cool, rough beneath her palm, yet it seemed to hum with energy. She closed her eyes and imagined the people who had stood here long before her, the builders, the carvers, the ones who placed the seeds and figurines inside. What had they hoped for? That their knowledge would endure, that someone, centuries later, would open the door and understand. Her eyes burned with unshed tears. She whispered into the night, not in words of science, but in words of gratitude. She promised silently that she would not allow the discovery to be reduced to spectacle or commodity. It would be respected, studied with care, and remembered for what it was, a testimony to the ingenuity and resilience of a people who had refused to let their memory be erased. The following days, she worked with renewed focus, preparing a comprehensive report that balanced scientific rigor with cultural sensitivity. She described the structures in painstaking detail, mapped the foundations with precision, cataloged the seeds and figurines with exacting accuracy. But she also included her interpretations, the idea that these were not simply shrines, but repositories of knowledge, symbolic archives meant to preserve both the practical and the spiritual essence of a culture. She wrote not only of what she had seen, but of what she had felt, the reverence demanded by the site, the sense of dialogue with the past. Still, she knew that a report was only the beginning. The true challenge would come later, when others sought to interpret, to test, to take. She imagined museums clamoring for the figurines, laboratories demanding the seeds, scholars publishing hurried analyses stripped of the context that made the discovery sacred. The thought made her stomach knot with dread. She resolved that when the time came, she would fight to ensure the integrity of the site, that it would be studied in place, preserved as a living archive rather than dissected into scattered fragments. Her colleagues, though not always sharing her depth of feeling, began to understand the gravity of what they had found. Their conversations grew quieter, more respectful, as if they too sensed the presence that lingered among the little houses. The guides, once wary, now treated the site with a reverence bordering on fear, refusing to step too close without Anna's permission. Even the forest seemed to conspire in the preservation of its secret, the sounds of its creatures softening when they entered the clearing, the air heavy with an almost sacred stillness. And yet, for all her determination, Anna could not escape the weight pressing on her. At night, she lay awake in her hammock, staring at the shifting patterns of moonlight on the canvas above her, wondering if she had the strength to carry the burden. What if she failed? What if, despite her best efforts, the discovery was twisted into something unrecognizable, stripped of the dignity it deserved? The questions gnawed at her, even as the days brought more clarity to her understanding of the site. One night, when sleep refused to come, she rose and walked again to the clearing. This time she carried her notebook and she sat cross-legged before the house, sketching it by moonlight. Her lines were uneven, her hand trembling with fatigue, but she felt compelled to capture it one more time, as if to etch it into her memory forever. When she finished, she closed the notebook and pressed it to her chest, whispering another silent promise, that she would not let the story be stolen. She would carry it carefully, like a vessel of seeds, into the uncertain future. By the time dawn broke, Anna felt a strange calm settle over her. The weight of discovery was heavy, but it was also a gift. She had been chosen not because of chance, but because she had been willing to listen, to see what others might have overlooked. And with that realization came a quiet resolve. The road ahead would be long, fraught with challenges, but she would walk it with the same patience and reverence that had guided the builders of the little houses. The discovery was not hers alone. It belonged to those who had made it, and to the generations who would one day learn from it. She was only the messenger, the witness, the guardian of a memory that had survived against all odds. When the expedition at last began its slow retreat from the forest, Anna felt a pull within her chest that was almost painful. Every step away from the clearing, from the little house, with its sealed door and the arc of foundations hidden beneath the soil, felt like a betrayal. She had spent days immersed in the weight of the discovery, nights haunted by the responsibility of protecting it, and now she was leaving it behind. Yet she knew she had no choice. The forest demanded respect, and their supplies and bodies had reached their limits. They had gathered what they could: maps, sketches, photographs, notes, but the true essence of the place could never be carried in a backpack. It would remain there, veiled in vines and shadow, waiting patiently as it had for centuries. The journey back to the river was grueling. Heavy rains had turned the soil into a treacherous mire, sucking at their boots and slowing every movement. The air clung to them like wet cloth, thick with the scent of decay and life entwined. The guides moved with practiced grace, but even they struggled under the weight of the equipment. The botanists carried their containers of samples with almost desperate care, and Anna held her journal close to her chest as though it were a sacred text. For her, it was. Within its pages lay the fragile bridge between past and present, a record of symbols, seeds, and stories that could vanish forever if she faltered. At night, when they set up temporary camps along the riverbank, Anna sat apart from the others, watching the water slide past in a slow, unyielding current. The jungle pressed close on every side, alive with unseen creatures, but her thoughts were fixed on the little houses. She imagined them standing silent in the clearing, their carvings glistening faintly with dew, their doors sealed once more. She imagined the seeds resting inside, still waiting, still promising life to whoever had the wisdom to honor them. Each image filled her with both sorrow and determination. She was not finished. This departure was not an end, but a pause, the first chapter in a story that would take years, perhaps a lifetime, to fully tell. When they reached the base camp, civilization returned in subtle, jarring ways. The hum of a generator, the harsh angles of man-made structures, the chatter of radios, all reminders that the world beyond the forest was impatient, hungry for results, eager for discovery to be translated into reports and headlines. Anna felt herself tense as her colleagues spoke excitedly of what awaited them: laboratories, conferences, publications. They wanted to unveil the discovery to the world, to secure funding and recognition. But Anna's heart resisted. She could not bear the thought of the little houses reduced to slides in a lecture, their carvings dissected into sterile categories, their seeds germinated for curiosity rather than reverence. Alone in her tent that night, she opened her journal and read through the pages from beginning to end. The words carried her back into the clearing, into the silence of the carvings and the weight of the figurines. She realized then that her duty extended beyond documentation. She would need to fight for the story to be told truthfully, to ensure that the memory of the people who had built the houses was not silenced again. The discovery was not hers. It belonged to them. And if she had been chosen to carry it forward, then she must do so with integrity, even if it meant defying the expectations of her peers. The return to the city was a blur of motion and sound. Airplanes replaced canoes, paved streets replaced rivers, and the rhythm of the jungle gave way to the clamor of engines and voices. Yet, through it all, Anna carried with her a quiet center, a stillness born of the forest. She presented her notes to the sponsoring institution, offered her preliminary findings, and spoke carefully, choosing words that emphasized respect over spectacle. Her colleagues, hungry for detail, pressed her for more, but she held back, determined that the site would not be plundered by curiosity or stripped of meaning by haste. Weeks passed, and reports began to circulate. Rumors spread of an extraordinary discovery in the Amazon, whispers of miniature houses, carved symbols, and ancient seeds. Scholars speculated wildly. Journalists demanded access. Institutions hinted at funding for further expeditions. Anna watched it all unfold with both pride and unease. Pride because the world was beginning to glimpse the richness of the culture she had uncovered. Unease because she knew how easily such glimpses could be distorted, how quickly reverence could turn to exploitation. One evening, as she walked alone through the university gardens, Anna paused beside a bed of young maize plants swaying gently in the breeze. She thought of the seeds she had seen inside the little house, seeds preserved through centuries of silence. These plants before her were ordinary, cultivated by modern methods, stripped of the sacred aura that had clung to their ancient counterparts. She realized then that the true gift of the discovery was not the possibility of reviving lost crops or filling museum cases with artifacts. The gift was the reminder that knowledge is not always written in books or etched in stone. Sometimes it is held in miniature houses, in spirals carved into wood, in the quiet patience of seeds waiting to be planted at the right time. Her thoughts returned again and again to the image of the builders. She saw them in her mind's eye, gathering around the little houses, placing offerings, sealing doors, speaking words that carried their wisdom forward. She felt their presence as a gentle urging, a call to honor what they had entrusted to the earth, and she knew that her task was not to claim ownership of their legacy, but to become its guardian. She would tell their story, not as an outsider imposing meaning, but as a witness passing on what she had seen and heard. In the months that followed, Anna began to draft her first major manuscript. It was not a dry report filled only with measurements and classifications, though all those details were present. It was a narrative, weaving together archaeology, botany, and anthropology, with reflections on memory, continuity, and respect. She wrote with the same intensity that had carried her through the forest, her words flowing as though guided by the voices of those long gone. She imagined the day it would be published, not as a triumph of her career, but as a restoration of dignity to a people who had refused to vanish. Late one night, as she sat alone at her desk, she set down her pen and looked at the sketches spread before her. The little house stared back at her from the page, its spirals still alive with mystery. She smiled faintly, her heart swelling with gratitude. The discovery had changed her, not only as a scholar but as a human being. It had taught her that history is not always grand, not always written in towering monuments or vast empires. Sometimes it is preserved in silence, in miniature houses hidden beneath vines, and seeds carried across centuries by faith alone. Anna closed her journal gently and whispered a quiet vow. She would continue the work. She would return to the forest when the time was right. She would guard the little houses and ensure that their story was told with the reverence they deserved. For in their fragile walls, in their sealed doors, in the careful arrangement of seeds and figurines, a new page in history had been opened, one that spoke not of conquest or destruction, but of memory, continuity, and hope. And as the night deepened around her, Anna felt the weight of the burden ease slightly, replaced by a sense of purpose. The past had not been lost. It had been waiting, patient and unyielding, for someone to listen. And she, Anna Rivera, had listened. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next incredible story. And make sure to watch the other videos on our channel. Each one hides a twist you won't believe. Share this video with your friends and family, because what happens in the jungle is only the beginning.